Isn't it strange how the smartest men in the room can sometimes be the blindest? On a scorching summer afternoon at Fort Holloway, a group of young technicians gathered around a silent relic, a UH-1 Huey helicopter, nicknamed the Patriot Bell. Their laptops hummed, their diagnostic screens glowed green, and every chart screamed the same message. Everything was fine. But the Huey sat lifeless. Its rotors drooped like broken wings. And when an old man in a faded jacket shuffled across the tarmac, the laughter started. "Look at Grandpa," one of them sneered. "Maybe he'll bless it with holy water." They thought he was just a relic from another era, a distraction brought in by some nostalgic general. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this man once made dead helicopters fly in the middle of a jungle war zone. And when the moment came, when the old veteran finally laid his hand on the Huey, everything changed. Stay with this story, because what happened on that runway is more than a tale about an old soldier and a stubborn machine. It's a lesson in humility, respect, and the kind of wisdom no computer can ever replace. If stories of forgotten heroes move you, if you believe some legacies are too important to fade, then keep reading. By noon the heat had settled over Fort Holloway like a wet towel someone forgot to wring out. The tarmac shimmered, the horizon wobbled, and the air above the runway pulsed in a way that made distance seem like a mirage. Out on Pad C, a UH-1 Huey sat in the center of a chalked circle as if it were the last stubborn guest at a party no one could end. The stenciled name along its nose, the Patriot Bell, had been touched up, but time still showed through the paint, the way old scars show through a sunburn. Every screen said the same thing, green. On the folding tables a line of ruggedized laptops hummed, diagnostic bars jittering. LEDs blinked healthy little heartbeats. Portable generator coughed along. Soldering irons lay untouched in their stands. A carton of safety glasses sat open like a bowl of mints nobody wanted. And a lightweight air hose traced a bright blue loop across the concrete. If you believed the data, this Huey should have been in the air an hour ago. Kyle Kramer didn't believe in ghosts, bad luck, or machines waking up on their own. He believed in checklists. 26 years old, square jaw, close fade, the kind of posture you get from 4 years of hearing eyes front. He was on his third laminated checklist of the morning and halfway through the sequence when he snapped the clipboard shut and nudged the helicopter skid with the side of his boot. "Everything's fine," he said to no one in particular. "It's perfect, in fact. It's a perfectly fine lawn ornament." "Been a while since I mowed the runway," Morales cracked, lifting the sweat-bent brim of his cap to wipe his forehead. Janie Dawson, the avionics specialist with a braid the color of new rope, ran her finger down a column on her screen. "Power at the ignition bus is nominal. Continuity across every harness. Sensors are clean. Fuel flow looks textbook." She glanced up, half pleading. "Kramer, I don't have a red flag for you to chase." Kramer rolled his neck until it popped. "Run it again." "We've run it 5 times, Morales said. "If we run it a 6th, the computer's gonna unionize." A few yards back, in the shade of a hangar eave, Lieutenant Wells watched over the scene with the thin patience of a young officer who has been told this is his moment and who will not, let it go sideways. He had the straight-backed rigidity of a man who ironed his own socks. "Status, Mr. Kramer?" "Sir, we have a non-start condition with no associated faults," Kramer said. All clipped syllables. He could do the dance. "Starter engages. Ignition sequence initializes. We get the cough, the first spark, and then it dies like someone closed a door." Wells checked his watch, a big black slab on his wrist, then looked toward the viewing stand across the field. The white canopy over there had the gleam of money and promises. Somewhere under it a few local officials were drinking cold water and asking one another if they would really get to sit in the famous Huey when it flew. The demo was supposed to have started at 11. "Base wants it airborne at 1300, Wells said. "Make it happen." Kramer swallowed a reply that would have felt great and gone over terribly. "Aye, sir." They'd already swapped the fuel filter on suspicion. They'd pulled the plugs and found them a little tired and then brand new. They'd traced the wiring looms with a continuity tester until they could recite the harness routes by heart. Dawson had even pulled up the PDF of the original maintenance manual, all grainy diagrams and paragraphs that read like a stern uncle. When the manual failed to contradict them, they moved on to the manufacturer's updated quick-ref charts. Nothing. Every path they took looped back to green lights and good news. Peterson drifted at the edge of it all, airman first class, logistics by duty but by temperament, the kind of kid who always volunteers to help. He ferried water bottles back and forth from a cooler, handed over multimeters and wrenches, and took the kind of mental notes you don't realize you're taking until later. He'd grown up on war documentaries and YouTube rabbit holes about rotorcraft, and he couldn't take his eyes off the Huey. It looked wrong on the ground, like a bird crouching too long. "Try priming a touch longer," Dawson suggested. "Just to humor me." Kramer worked the controls, lips moving around the numbers in the sequence. For a few seconds the sound rose toward life, the staccato cough of promise, then choked out again. The rotors ticked forward as if thinking it over and changed their minds. "Same," Kramer said. Morales put both hands on his head and squinted at the sky. "If I promise to re-enlist, will it start out of spite?" "Save the deal for your love life," Kramer said. But the grin he threw over his shoulder to sell the joke didn't stick. Sweat tracked the side of his face and collected along his jaw. Wells stepped forward, his voice pitched to Carey. "Kramer, we're done tinkering. What's the plan?" "Sir, the plan is we're going to find the one component that's lying to us. Something's misreporting healthy." "Which component?" "If I knew that, sir, we'd be flying." Wells didn't sigh. Men like him didn't sigh in public. "You have 30 minutes. After that we tow it to Hangar 2 and begin disassembly in a controlled environment." Kramer clenched his molars. Disassembly was defeat. You didn't tear down a legend on the tarmac like a stubborn lawnmower. Not with the white tent across the way. Not with cameras turning on. He leaned into the cabin again, fingers drumming the edge of the panel, while Dawson watched the laptop's streamlines of calm green. It wasn't just the technology that bothered him. It was the vibe, the feeling of a joke being told about you that you couldn't hear all of yet. Somebody had promised a flight. Somebody had invited important people to come see a cymbal soar. Now a handful of 20-somethings in crisp coveralls were about to make a liar out of a colonel. $10 says it's heat soak," Morales offered, just to be saying something. "We're baking the same failure over and over." $10 says you owe me $10, Kramer said. He scrubbed a hand over his buzzed hair. "Okay, humor me back. Dawson, pull the trend data on fuel pressure from yesterday's taxi run. Look for any flutter before shutdown." Dawson pulled it up. Flat, like a board. Starter amperage? Within tolerance. Voltage ripple? Nominal. Nominal. Within tolerance. In family. Fine. Words without weight. Peterson hovered closer. "If it helps, my granddad said his Harley used to false start when the choke linkage caught." "He'd." "We're not talking about a Harley," Kramer said, sharper than he meant to. "We're talking about a turbine, right?" Peterson flushed and stepped back, the water bottle sweating in his hand. A golf cart whined up and braked hard near the line. A staff sergeant hopped off and handed Wells a handheld. "XO wants an update." Wells took it, paced a few steps, and talked low. Peterson watched the lieutenant's jaw tighten, loosen, tighten again. He could read the shape of the conversation the way you read weather off the tops of trees. The wind's shifting. Someone's getting impatient. Someone's reminding someone else that donors like helicopters and helicopters like to fly. When Wells came back, he didn't look at Kramer right away. He looked at the Huey. His eyes traveled the rivet lines, the open access panels, the flaking place where some long ago nose art had been sanded away. Then he fixed on Kramer. "We've requested external support," he said. "A consultant." Kramer straightened. "From where?" "From the past?" Morales muttered, almost under his breath. Wells gave him a look that could crumple paper. Then to Kramer, "From the general's office." "Don't make me repeat myself." Kramer felt the prickle of defensiveness and something else. Insult? Rise under his skin. "Sir, with respect, we have 12 certified avionics techs on this line, 3 master mechanics on call, and a direct channel to the manufacturer. If there's a fix out there, we can..." Then find it, Wells said. And welcome the consultant when he arrives. The golf cart buzzed off. Silence fell in that odd way it does in noisy places, a pocket of hush inside the hum. A gull wheeled overhead and barked. Out on the far runway a C-130 lumbered, and the air carried the flat thunder of its props. The heat pressed down, wringing a little more resolve out of everybody. Kramer went back to the sequence. Dawson recalibrated 3 sensors that didn't need it because sometimes pretending to change something changed something. Morales fetched a fresh coil of safety wire because it gave his hands a job. Peterson noticed the way the Huey's tail boom caught the sun, throwing a narrow blade of light across the pad like a pointer. It pointed to a small access panel near the exhaust, paint slightly different around its edges, like someone had put it back on long ago and never quite got it flush. He opened his mouth to mention it, then didn't. He had learned in 2 months on the flight line that sometimes your best contribution was to keep the water cold and your advice colder. They tried the start again. Again the cough, the promise, the collapse. Kramer sat back in the pilot's seat and stared through the glass at nothing. You know, Morales said, if it really is a lawn ornament, we should at least put some fake flowers in the skids. Make it festive. Someone snickered. Laughter has a way of turning into a shield before it turns into a weapon. A gray sedan rolled up the service road and eased to a stop near the pad. It didn't come with the frantic dust raising that meant brass in a hurry. It just arrived, engine ticking as it settled. The driver stayed inside while the passenger door opened and a man climbed out slowly, one hand on the frame for balance. He wore jeans and a faded olive jacket, the kind that had gone in and out of fashion 3 times. His hair was white, not the fashion white of a hip barber, but the work white of a man who had seen years stack up and hadn't bothered to dye them away. He stood there for a second as if getting his bearings in a place he had never been and also been forever. Then he started toward the Huey at a walking pace that matched the day. Wells noticed him first, and a little frown pulled at the clean line of his mouth. He took 2 crisp steps forward. Can I help you, sir? This is a restricted. The old man's eyes were pale and steady. General Michelson sent for me. Kramer looked over from the cockpit, saw the jacket, the slow step, the leather pouch tucked under the man's arm. A small laugh slid out before he could stop it, and then, because you never laugh alone on a flight line, 2 more popped up behind it. Consultant from the Smithsonian? Morales said, and this time the laugh spread, tasteless and easy. Someone said, maybe he'll lay hands on it. And someone else said, maybe it needs a bedtime story. Peterson, halfway between the cooler and the tables, didn't laugh. He watched the old man's face when the jokes hit. It didn't change, not a flinch. The pale eyes went past all of them and landed on the Huey like recognition, like greeting an old friend you haven't seen since the day you both did something you never told anyone about. The old man stopped at the edge of the circle, and the heat, the noise, the scuffed chalk line all seemed to bend around the small space he took up. He didn't reach out to touch the skin of the bird. He just looked the way you look at a door when you've still got a key somewhere. Wells cleared his throat. Name? The old man nodded once. Eli Vance. Kramer's smile tightened. Grandpa's got a name. And the Huey, the dead bird, sat quiet and watched them all, as if it knew who had finally arrived. The old man didn't rush. He stood there at the edge of the tarmac like someone waiting for the right note in a song only he could hear. His eyes stayed on the helicopter. He didn't blink much. He didn't seem to notice the laughter, or if he did, he'd been inoculated against that kind of thing a long time ago. Mr. Vance? Lieutenant Wells said, adjusting his cap and his tone, though the respect in it was paper-thin. We appreciate your presence, but my team is already handling the situation. Eli Vance tilted his head slightly, like a bird considering a seed. His voice, when it came, rasped low but steady. You're handling the parts. I'm here for the bird. Kramer barked a laugh that came out sharper than he meant. The bird? Sir, with all respect, this isn't 1969. We don't talk to machines. We troubleshoot them. He gestured broadly at the laptops, the meters, the racks of tools. That's how it's done now. Eli's gaze never left the Huey. Troubleshoot all you like. You'll still come up empty. The technicians traded smirks. as if they'd stumbled onto free entertainment in the middle of a bad day. Morales leaned against the toolbox. Maybe he's right, Kramer. Maybe the thing needs a pep talk. Go on. Whisper sweet nothings in the carburetor. That got another round of chuckles. Even Wells allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch, though he caught it quickly. Peterson, standing off to the side, felt the laughter hang in the air like cigarette smoke, stale and unkind. Something about the old man's stillness made the mockery bounce off and land back on the tellers. Eli began to walk a slow circle around the Huey. His hands stayed deep in the pockets of his faded jacket. Every step was deliberate, heel to toe, as though pacing out a ritual. The technicians tracked him with a mixture of derision and curiosity. He bent a little to look at the skid, then craned his neck to study the rotor mast. You gonna conjure something? Kramer asked, his tone part sneer, part defense against the unease creeping up on him. Eli didn't answer. His eyes were tracing lines no schematic could show, remembering routes of vibration, heat, stress. Machines wore their memories if you knew where to look. At the tail boom he paused, crouching slow, his knees stiff with years. For a moment, his hand hovered above the metal, fingers spread like he could feel its heartbeat through the air. He withdrew it, straightened with effort, and moved on. From Wells's tablet came a low chime. He tapped the screen, pulled up the consultant file, and scanned the brief dossier. Says here you were a crew chief in Vietnam, Mr. Vance. His tone put quotation marks around the title. Eli finally looked at him. His pale eyes were clear, unblinking. That's what they called it. Kramer shook his head and smirked. A crew chief. So you patched bullet holes and swapped rotors in the mud. We're not in a jungle anymore, Pop. We've got diagnostics that cost more than your house. For the first time, Eli's gaze flickered toward Kramer. He didn't bristle. He didn't frown. He just looked, and for a second Kramer felt like the floor tilted under him. Eli stopped near a small, nearly invisible panel below the exhaust. He squinted, tilted his head, but said nothing. Wells, impatient, gestured broadly. Well, do you see anything our equipment missed? Eli's voice was quiet, but it carried. That panel. Has it been opened? Kramer let out a theatrical groan and marched over. He ran a hand across the flush surface. It's fine. Torque specs are perfect. Sensors behind it are all green. No reason to break the seal. You checked the sensors, Eli said. Not the soul. Morales laughed outright. Did he just say soul? Okay. Now I've heard everything. The soul of a helicopter, Kramer repeated, spreading his hands to the others. Gentlemen, forget the oscilloscope. We need a priest. The crew roared with laughter this time. Even Dawson smirked behind her screen, though Peterson noticed she didn't laugh as hard as the rest. But Eli didn't react. He continued his slow orbit of the Huey, and as he walked, his mind slipped somewhere else. The air was thicker there, heavy with humidity, stinking of diesel, rot, and cordite. The thump of rotor blades pounded so hard it rattled his teeth. He was 20 again, shirt soaked through, knuckles split open from hurried work. A Huey screamed overhead, smoke trailing from the cowling. The radio buzzed with panic, shouted coordinates, voices cracking with fear. Tracer rounds stitched the canopy below. The bird sagged in the sky, coughing, bleeding power. Men inside prayed, cursed, or wept. He was clinging to the skid, the jungle a blur below, wind tearing at him, trying to fling him into oblivion. In his pouch, this same battered pouch, he found the stubby wrench he'd ground by hand, the roll of sealing tape, the only things between the bird and a jungle grave. His hands had been steady then, steadier than his heart. He'd crawled along the fuselage under enemy fire, patched, tightened, whispered curses that turned into prayers. And somehow, impossibly, the engine had caught, the rotors had held, and the bird had flown. They called him a crew chief. But the pilots had whispered another name. The ghost. The heat of the memory lifted, leaving him on the baking tarmac again. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The laughter still lingered, but Peterson noticed something shift. The old man didn't look beaten or defensive. He looked timeless. And the Huey sat in silence, rotors drooping, as if waiting for the only man who ever truly knew how to speak its language. The sun dragged shadows across the tarmac, lengthening the Huey's silhouette like the outline of a resting beast. The Patriot Bell still refused to stir, its green-lit diagnostics mocking every effort, its silence growing heavier with each failed attempt. Lieutenant Wells pinched the bridge of his nose and glanced again at the white canopy across the runway. The dignitaries fanned themselves with glossy pamphlets, their faces flushed, their patience thin. If this demonstration collapsed, it wouldn't just be an embarrassment. It would be a career-stalling disaster. "Status, Kramer?" Wells barked, his voice taut with strain. Kramer was kneeling by the access panel Eli had mentioned. His hand still rested on the bolts, though he hadn't loosened a single one. He looked over his shoulder, jaw set. "Sir, as I said before, the panel's not the issue. Every reading downstream is nominal. Opening it would generate unnecessary paperwork, not to mention break a factory seal for no reason." Eli stood just behind him, still as stone, the heat rippling around his frame. "That seal was broken once before," he murmured. Kramer scoffed. "And I suppose you were there?" Eli's pale eyes met his, calm and unnerving. "Yes." The word hung in the air, heavier than the heat. For a moment, no one knew whether to laugh again or stay quiet. Morales, unable to handle silence, chuckled. "Well, Grandpa's got stories. Maybe we should pull up some lawn chairs." "Enough," Wells snapped. His authority cracked like a whip, but it felt brittle, forced. He turned to Eli. "Mr. Vance, this is a secure military operation. I was told you'd be observing, not interfering." "Observing is exactly what I'm doing," Eli said softly. "And what I observe is a bird with her soul switched off." The word soul drew another ripple of smirks, but Peterson didn't laugh. He stood near the cooler, clutching his water bottle, watching the exchange with unease. Something about Eli's tone, it wasn't mystical, not really. It was intimate, as if he knew the Huey the way a man knows his own heartbeat. Across the line of laptops, Dawson frowned. She hadn't spoken since the laughter earlier, but now her eyes flicked between Eli and the panel. She pulled up the schematic, then closed it again. Something gnawed at her, a whisper she couldn't shake. "Lieutenant," Peterson blurted before he could stop himself. His voice cracked under the weight of every rank in the room. "Maybe we should just let him check." All eyes turned on him. The rookie logistics airman, the water boy. Wells's face tightened. "Airman Peterson, your input is not required." Peterson flushed scarlet and took a step back, but Eli turned his head slowly, meeting his eyes. He gave the faintest nod, gratitude, recognition. Peterson felt it like a hand on his shoulder. The lieutenant's radio crackled, saving him from further humiliation. Wells snatched it up. "Wells here." The voice on the other end was clipped, furious. "Status report, Lieutenant." "No change, Colonel," Wells replied, his throat tight. "We're still troubleshooting a no-start condition. The technicians are running level 3 diagnostics." "And the civilian?" The colonel's voice bristled with skepticism. "The one General Michelson insisted upon?" Wells hesitated. His eyes flicked to Eli, who stood quietly, hands in his jacket pockets. "He's here, sir. He's observing." There was a pause on the line, a silence heavy enough that even Kramer felt it. Then the colonel's voice, sharp as a blade. "Put him on with the general. Now." The order landed like a thunderclap. Wells froze, color draining from his face. "Sir, with respect, perhaps." "Now, Lieutenant." The radio went dead. For a beat, the flight line stood in stunned silence. A couple of technicians shuffled uneasily, glancing at one another. Wells's mouth opened, then closed again. His authority was bleeding out in front of his team. He turned, stiff-backed, and thrust the handset toward Eli. "The general wishes to speak with you." But before Eli could take it, Peterson moved. Something in him rebelled against the condescension, the mockery, the utter blindness of what was happening. He remembered his own grandfather, quiet at family dinners, hands scarred from tank repairs in the Ardennes. A man no one ever asked for stories, though he had carried the weight of them all his life. Peterson's gut screamed at him now. He fished his personal cell phone from his pocket, thumb trembling as he scrolled through contacts. A number glowed on the screen, the direct line of Major Davies, aide to General Michelson. Peterson had met him once, barely enough for recognition. Calling him now was reckless, maybe even career suicide. But he pressed call. The major answered on the second ring, his voice brisk and harried. "Davies." "Sir, this is Airman Peterson at the Fort Holloway flight line," Peterson said quickly, low enough that the others couldn't hear. "I'm sorry to call directly, but it's about Mr. Vance." "What about him?" the major asked sharply. "He's fine, sir, but the lead tech and the lieutenant, they're treating him like he's senile, laughing at him. They won't let him near the aircraft. They're trusting the computers, and the computers don't know what's wrong. But he does. I swear he does." There was silence. Peterson's stomach lurched. He imagined the major barking for security, his career evaporating in an instant. Then, shuffling, a chair scraping, muffled voices. Peterson heard the major's tone change, urgent now. "General, you need to hear this." Peterson ended the call, heart hammering, and slid the phone back into his pocket. When he turned, Eli was still standing with the radio in hand, speaking quietly into it now. None of the others could hear his words, but there was a stillness to him, a gravity, like a man speaking with an equal. Kramer muttered under his breath, "What the hell is going on?" No one answered. The tarmac seemed to hum with a new tension, sharper than heat or embarrassment. Something was moving now, something bigger than all of them. The Patriot Bell stayed quiet, its rotors drooping. But Peterson swore he felt it too, the faintest shift in the air, as if the old bird was waiting for the right pair of hands. The command center at Fort Holloway was a world away from the sunburned tarmac. Inside, the air was cool, the lights fluorescent, and the atmosphere razor-sharp with impatience. Maps lined the walls, dotted with colored pins and annotated in grease pencil. Phones rang and were snapped up within half a ring. At the head of the long table stood General Michelson, a man carved in angles, broad shoulders, granite jaw, eyes that could pin a recruit at 50 paces. 3 stars glinted on his collar. He had been watching the clock for an hour, aware of the dignitaries across the base, aware of the promises he had made. He hated waiting. He hated excuses more. Major Davies pressed a phone into his hand. "Sir, Airman Peterson on the line. He says it's about Eli Vance." The general's brows lifted a fraction. Then his eyes narrowed. He took the phone. "This is Michelson." On the other end, Peterson's voice was shaky but urgent. "Sir, forgive me for speaking out of turn. Mr. Vance is here, but the technicians, they're mocking him. They won't let him near the helicopter. They say the computers are all green, but he says it has a soul. And I believe him, sir. I think he knows what's wrong." For a long moment, there was only silence. Peterson thought the call had dropped. Then came the low growl of the general's voice, steady as a mountain and twice as heavy. "Major," Michelson said, turning to his aide, "conference me with Colonel Hayes and the tower. Then get me a car. I'm going down there myself." The staff froze. Chairs squeaked. A colonel half rose to protest, but one look from the general sent him back into his seat. Michelson's voice, when he spoke again, was deadly calm. "For those of you who don't know," he said, sweeping the room with his gaze, "the man my officers are ridiculing is Elias Vance. In the Ashau Valley, 1968, he kept 60% of the 1st Cavalry's Hueys in the air using scrap metal and willpower. They called him the Ghost. When helicopters died, he brought them back. That Huey on the line, the Patriot Bell, was his bird. He logged more than 1,000 combat hours in her. That machine is standing because he kept it standing." The general's hand tightened on the phone. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire room. "The Patriot Bell isn't just a museum piece. It's a monument. And no machine on this earth knows a man better than that bird knows Eli Vance. Back on the tarmac, Wells shifted uneasily as Eli handed the radio back to him. The old man's expression was unreadable, calm, maybe even weary, but the lieutenant felt a knot tightening in his stomach. A low rumble grew in the distance. 3 black command vehicles tore down the service road, engines growling, tires squealing as they braked to a halt. Dust swirled in the oppressive air. Doors slammed. Out of the lead vehicle stepped General Michelson himself. He did not run, did not shout. He moved with controlled speed, each stride purposeful, like a storm wrapped in uniform. Kramer swallowed hard. Morales muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. The general cut across the tarmac, ignoring the technicians, ignoring Wells, ignoring everyone until he reached Eli. Then, with a crack that echoed in the stunned silence, Michelson brought his boots together and raised his hand in a perfect salute. "Mr. Vance," the general said, his voice booming across the flight line, "it is an honor to have you on my base, and I apologize for everything." The words struck like lightning. The technicians froze, jaws slack. Wells's stomach plummeted. He felt cold despite the heat pressing down on him. Eli nodded once, almost sadly, and returned the salute with the barest inclination of his head. "General." Michelson dropped his hand but stayed at attention. His eyes, suddenly hard again, swung toward Wells and Kramer. "This man," he announced, his voice now low and lethal, "is Elias the Ghost Vance. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, a bronze star with Valor. He has more combat hours as a crew chief than every pilot on this base combined. And you dared to laugh at him." The words sliced deeper than any shouted curse. Kramer felt his throat tighten. Wells could not meet anyone's gaze. The general stabbed a finger toward the Huey. "That helicopter is alive today because of him. In 1970, he modified her fuel system in a monsoon on a mud floor with tools he made himself. A modification that saved my platoon from annihilation. I was there. I owe him my life. We all do." Silence thundered in the wake of his words. Even the dignitaries across the field seemed hushed, sensing something momentous had shifted. The Patriot Bell sat quiet, still stubborn. But now every eye on that flight line looked at her differently. Not as a dead relic, not as a failed demo, as a living monument. And the only man who could wake her, the ghost, stood quietly with his worn jacket and battered leather pouch, ready to listen to her heart. The Patriot Bell shimmered in the haze, still as a statue. Every technician on the flight line stood frozen, the sound of the command vehicle's engines still echoing in their ears. General Michelson cut across the tarmac like a man with no time left to waste. His eyes, locked on Eli Vance, didn't flicker toward the rows of laptops, the scattered tools, or the gathered technicians. For the first time in their careers, Wells and Kramer felt utterly invisible. The general stopped in front of Eli and delivered a second salute, sharper than the first. "Mr. Vance," he said, voice steady, carrying across the entire line. "You honor us by standing here." Eli inclined his head, pale eyes tired but unflinching. "It's been a long road, General." Only then did Michelson turn to face the others. His gaze swept the technicians like a blade. "And yet, instead of honoring him, you treated him like a nuisance. You mocked him." Wells's throat bobbed. He snapped to attention, trying to salvage dignity. "Sir, if I may explain." The general's eyes cut to him, silencing him instantly. Michelson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet tone was worse than a scream. "Lieutenant Wells, you laid hands on this man, on Elias Vance, the ghost. You threatened the only living soul who knows this machine's secrets better than any manual. You disgraced your uniform." Wells's jaw clenched, but his voice was gone. Michelson shifted his gaze to Kramer. "And you, full of arrogance, blind faith in diagnostics, contempt for wisdom older than your computers. You nearly threw away a legend's help because you thought you knew better." Kramer opened his mouth, but no words came. His face burned crimson. The general's glare lingered on them both, then softened as Eli lifted a hand gently, resting it on Michelson's sleeve. "They're good men," Eli said quietly. "Young. They trust their screens because that's the world they were given. They don't know the noise of a rotor blade screaming under fire. They don't know what it means when a machine becomes your only way out. They just haven't learned yet." The technicians shifted uneasily. To be defended by the man they had ridiculed cut deeper than the general's rebuke. For a moment, the general studied Eli's lined face. Then he gave a single curt nod and stepped back. "She's all yours, Ghost." Eli moved toward the Huey. The crowd parted around him like water around a rock. The battered leather pouch hung from his hand, its snap polished smooth by decades of use. He laid his palm against the side of the Huey's fuselage, just below the nose art. For a moment he closed his eyes. "You've been waiting long enough," he murmured, too softly for most to hear. The technicians watched, breath caught, as Eli crouched near the small panel Kramer had dismissed. His fingers brushed the bolts with the tenderness of a man recognizing an old scar. From his pouch, he withdrew the odd, dark wrench, curved at an angle no factory tool could match. The laughter was gone now. In its place was silence thick enough to hear a gull crying 100 yards away. Kramer's stomach nodded. Dawson's heart pounded in her ears. Peterson leaned forward unconsciously, every muscle taut. The general folded his arms, his gaze never leaving Eli. And for the first time all day, the Patriot Bell seemed less like a dead bird baking in the sun, more like a living thing holding its breath, waiting for the hand it remembered. The heat radiating off the Huey made the metal shimmer like a mirage. Eli crouched by the exhaust cowling, knees stiff, steadying himself with one palm pressed against the fuselage. The younger men had dismissed this panel as irrelevant. Perfect torque, flawless readings, no faults flagged. To them it was just another sealed plate in a sea of rivets. But Eli knew better. From his battered leather pouch he drew a tool that looked like it belonged in a museum, not on a modern airfield. The wrench was darkened by age, curved oddly, its edges worn smooth from countless grips. To the untrained eye it was junk, hand-forged, primitive. To Eli it was the key to a secret heart no computer could recognize. Kramer muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "A homemade wrench. Great. Maybe he'll whittle us a new rotor blade while he's at it." The smirk on his face faltered when Michelson's cold stare found him. The general said nothing, he didn't need to. Kramer's mouth snapped shut like a trap. Eli worked the bolts slowly, deliberately. Each one loosened with a soft metallic sigh, as if relieved to be freed by the only hands that had ever truly understood them. The panel came away smooth, revealing a narrow tangle of wires and tubing. Nestled deep within was a lever no manual mentioned, no sensor monitored. Eli leaned close, eyes narrowing. "Still right where I left you." He reached the wrench tip in, nudged the lever. With a faint click, it slid into bypass. Nothing dramatic happened, no alarms, no sparks, no error codes. Just silence. He replaced the panel, tightened the bolts, each twist of his wrist practiced. Sure. Then he rose, slower than he once would have, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had never doubted. Turning to the technicians, Eli dusted his hands on his faded jeans. "Someone want to give her a try now?" Kramer hesitated, but Michelson's gaze pinned him in place. He swallowed hard, climbed into the cockpit, and strapped himself into the pilot's seat. His hands trembled slightly as they hovered over the controls. "Startup sequence," Eli said calmly, his voice guiding like a metronome. Just like before. Kramer's fingers moved through the familiar motions. Switches flipped, indicators glowed, the checklist ticked down. He hesitated at the ignition. "Go on," Eli murmured. Kramer pressed the switch. The Huey coughed once, different this time. Not the hollow gasp of a machine giving up, but the raw clearing of a throat long silent. Another cough, deeper, then a growl. The turbine engine caught with a thunderous roar, shaking the air itself. The rotors twitched, then began to spin, slow at first, then faster, faster still. The familiar whump. Whump. Whump built into a pounding heartbeat that rolled across the base. Every head on the line snapped upward. Technicians who had been sneering minutes ago now stared with wide eyes, awe breaking across their faces. Morales dropped the wrench he was holding. Dawson pressed a hand over her mouth. Peterson's throat tightened, and he realized there were tears pricking his eyes. The Patriot Bell was alive. Heat blasted from the exhaust, the air vibrating with power. The Huey's blades blurred into an invisible disc, slicing the sky. The sound so deep it rattled bones and stirred memories none of the younger crew had lived. A spontaneous cheer erupted down the line. It wasn't ordered. It wasn't protocol. It was raw, unfiltered amazement. Kramer sat frozen in the cockpit, hands trembling on the controls. His earlier arrogance melted into something closer to reverence. For the first time, he felt the machine breathe beneath him. Not numbers on a screen, not lines of data, but life. Eli stepped back, his pale eyes reflecting the spinning rotor. His expression wasn't smug. It wasn't triumphant. It was sad, almost wistful. The Huey's voice had returned, but only he knew how many ghosts it carried with it. General Michelson's voice cut through the roar, deep and steady. Gentlemen, you just witnessed a miracle. Not from machines, not from software, from a man who listened when no one else could. The technicians clapped, some with shaking hands. Peterson whispered under his breath, almost a prayer. She's back. And for one burning moment on that sun-baked flight line, every soul present understood. They hadn't just started an old helicopter. They had resurrected a legend. The Patriot Bell idled on the tarmac, her rotors humming like the satisfied purr of an animal brought back from the edge. The sound rolled across Fort Holloway, echoing off hangars, bleeding into the white canopy where dignitaries leapt to their feet in applause. For the young technicians, it was a revelation. For Eli Vance, it was a reminder. Machines could be coaxed back to life, but time never ran backward. When the demonstration flight finally lifted into the sky, Kramer at the controls under Eli's watchful eye, there was no more laughter. Only silence, awe, and the humbling realization that they had witnessed a man breathe life into history. In the days that followed, repercussions came swift but quiet. General Michelson, true to his nature, didn't convene courts-martial or issue public reprimands. Instead, he acted with the same deliberate precision Eli had shown on the tarmac. Maintenance crews across the command received notice of a new mandatory program, the Heritage Initiative. Every technician, mechanic, and avionics specialist would spend part of their training learning the history of their craft. Not from PDFs and schematics, but from the stories of those who had lived it. The first module was about the UH-1 Huey. The opening slide showed a grainy photograph of a young crew chief in Vietnam, shirt stained with sweat, leaning against the Patriot Bell with a wrench in his hand. The caption read simply, Elias, the Ghost Vance. For the technicians who had laughed at him, the sight of that photo burned. Not because it humiliated them, but because it reminded them that they had once stood in the presence of living history and failed to recognize it. A week later, on a quiet afternoon, Wells and Kramer found themselves parked outside a roadside diner a few miles from the base. The neon sign buzzed weakly in the window, advertising coffee and pie. Inside, the booths were worn. The air smelled of bacon grease and fresh coffee, and the jukebox in the corner cycled lazily through country ballads. Eli sat alone in a booth near the window, a chipped mug of coffee steaming in front of him. His jacket was folded neatly beside him, the leather pouch resting on top. He looked like he belonged there, part of the furniture, part of the story the walls themselves could tell. For a long moment, Wells and Kramer stood at the door, hats in their hands, unsure how to begin. The lieutenant's face was pale, stripped of its earlier arrogance. Kramer, once quick with jokes, now shifted from foot to foot like a schoolboy outside a principal's office. Wells cleared his throat. Mr. Vance. Eli looked up, eyes calm, unreadable. He nodded. Lieutenant. Kramer. Kramer swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was thick. Sir, we came to apologize. For everything. The way we treated you. The things we said. There's no excuse. Eli studied their faces, not with judgment, but with a kind of tired curiosity. He saw in them what he had once been. Young men too proud to admit what they didn't know, too quick to laugh at what they couldn't understand. He gestured to the empty booth across from him. "Sit down. Coffee's cheap, and it's on me." The two men slid into the booth. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The waitress poured their cups, and the clink of china filled the silence. Finally, Eli leaned back, fingers laced loosely over his chest. "You boys trust your screens," he said gently. "That's not wrong. But sometimes the screens don't know what a machine is supposed to sound like. They can't feel the hum in the frame or the way a bolt turns too easy. They don't know the smell of hot oil when it's not quite right. That's not in the manual." Kramer nodded slowly, staring into his coffee. Wells rubbed his temple, shame etched deep into the lines of his face. "You weren't wrong to believe in your tools," Eli continued. "But you were wrong to laugh at what you didn't understand. Respect," he tapped the table lightly with one finger, "isn't optional. Not for men. Not for machines. Not for history." The words weren't scolding. They were steady, patient, like a teacher guiding a lesson that mattered more than any test. For the first time, Wells spoke, his voice low. "We should have listened." Eli's pale eyes softened. "You will next time. That's what matters." He reached for his mug, took a sip, and let the silence stretch. Then, with a faint smile, he leaned forward. "Now, you boys ever want to hear how the Bell flew through a monsoon with half her transmission scattered across the mud?" Kramer blinked, then smiled weakly. Wells gave a nervous chuckle, and slowly, tension drained from the booth. As the sun slanted through the diner window, Eli began to speak. His voice carried them back through decades, to jungles, to firefights, to rotor blades that cut through storm and gunfire alike. The young men listened, not as skeptics, not as officers, but as students at the feet of a master. And in that small diner, over chipped mugs of coffee, a bridge was built, between arrogance and humility, between past and present, between a forgotten veteran and the future he had unknowingly shaped. Back at Fort Holloway, the Patriot Bell rested in her hangar, freshly polished, a plaque bolted beside her skid. It bore a single inscription: "For Elias, the ghost Vance, who taught us that machines live when we listen, and legends endure when we remember." Eli Vance didn't just bring a helicopter back to life. He reminded everyone at Fort Holloway of a truth too easily forgotten. Heroes don't always wear stars on their collars. Sometimes they wear faded jackets, carry worn pouches, and walk with the weight of memory. The Patriot Bell soared again, not because of diagnostics or manuals, but because of the hands and heart of the man who had once kept her alive under fire. Eli's lesson was larger than mechanics. It was about respect, humility, and the power of listening to those who came before us. As long as stories like his are told, legends never die. If the story moved you, honor the memory of men like Eli Vance. Like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Endless Stories, so that the quiet valor of forgotten veterans will always be remembered.